Let me just. My name is Alan Palais, and this is the Sunday morning service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Pottstown on July 11th, 2021. I'm a member of the congregation and will be the lay leader this morning. We are a congregation that welcomes all. Whether you're seeing us with spirits high or spirits low, we welcome you. Whether your beliefs tend towards atheism or theism, liberalism or conservatism, we welcome you. We welcome all who are seeking, searching, looking for more knowledge, more service, more friendship. Our religion, Unitarian Universalism, is built on 7 ethical principles. You will find them in our website under the tab Be Our Guest. With these principles in mind, we consider a wide array of topics in our various Sunday morning services, and we have a wide array of speakers, including our ministers, guest ministers, members of our congregation, and lay speakers from outside our fellowship. Okay, we're ready for announcements. Are there any announcements? Kay? Unmute yourself, Kay.
This weekend, this Saturday from 9 to 12, we have a cleanup party and then a cookout with hot dogs and a blueberry dessert. So we welcome everybody to come to work inside and outside and kind of spiff up the fellowship and the grounds. Thanks.
Any more announcements? Okay. We don't have many rituals in Unitarian Universalism, but one of them is lighting the chalice. It is an event that marks the beginning of the main part of our service, where we change the focus of our minds from our everyday activities to a more relaxed, contemplative state. Mary, would you light the chalice for us? Our opening hymn is number 121, We'll Build a Land, and I'm going to project the words so you could sing. You have to sing by yourself at home or wherever you're seeing this service, and be sure to mute yourself if you want to sing along. Can people see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me do this. There we go. Carly, would you play We'll Build a Land? Thank you, Carly. Okay. We are a caring community with an interest in the joys and concerns of our members and friends. Does anyone have a joy or concern they would like to share?
Yes, I actually have a joy that I can share. So I recently got a job in Westchester or around Westchester, so I'll be able to stay for another year. So that means I can join church services on Sundays and like get to stick around for everyone. So that's a big joy for me.
Congratulations. Great. I have one little concern. I'm a klutz. See this? It's got a 3 stitches in there. I didn't realize that the very nasty quasi machete I was working at had both a sharp edge and a serrated edge. And I was cutting a branch that's about this thick with the serrated edge. And I don't know if I went to grab it or I went next to it. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, well, okay, that cut me a little bit. And I kept sawing. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, there's a lot of blood here. So anyway, ended up going upstairs, pouring alcohol on it, screaming, then putting a gauze on it and driving up to urgent care where they put the stitches in. When you hit meat on yourself that you're going to get stitches. It hurt.
When did it happen, Mary?
Thursday.
Okay. Well,
So it said 10 days to 2 weeks before they take the stitches out. And of course I'm doing math and going, but it'll be fine.
any other joys or concerns? Well, it's nice to hear that we had only one concern and that it's working out. But we have to keep in mind that there are likely concerns that people have that are unspoken. Okay, we come to a reading now. In developing her message about diversity, our speaker, Reverend Robinson, will speak about the limits of what we can know. It's an area that interests me, so I chose a reading for this morning related to that topic. First, a few words of introduction. I am amazed by how much we humans have come to know about how the world works. On the other hand, it is humbling to recognize how very much we still don't know, and how much may lie beyond our cognitive ability to ever know. Therefore, dealing with uncertainty is a challenge we face both as individuals and in society. A lot can be said about this, but this morning I will present just a few of the thoughts about knowing and uncertainty from the physicist Richard Feynman. He writes, I think it is much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which are likely wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of uncertainty about different things, but I am not absolutely sure of anything. I don't feel frightened not knowing things, not frightened by being in a mysterious universe. If we remain unsure, we will leave opportunities for alternatives. We will not become too enthusiastic for the fact, knowledge, the absolute truth of the day. In order to make progress, one must leave the door to the unknown ajar. I think Richard Feynman, as a physicist, was talking about the physical, but I think this applies to the spiritual as well. And I think this expresses an attitude that is very common in Unitarian Universalism. Okay, now we come to the offering. The financial generosity of our members and friends has kept us going during this difficult COVID period. But things are getting better. Last week, we had our first in-person service since the beginning of the COVID period, and we conducted it outside. Doing the service outside was so successful, thanks to the beauty of our fellowship site and the team that sets things up, that we will have another outdoor service next week. And I look forward to more in the future. And we are preparing our building for indoor services. We do offertories to help make sure that we will keep these good things going. You can contribute by going to the chat box at any time and click on the link under the word donate, and then do the rest. You could also send checks. Carly, could you play that musical piece we talked about for a few minutes? Thank you, Carly. I'd like to now introduce our speaker. Our speaker today, Reverend Christine Robinson, is a retired UU minister. She was raised a UU in Washington, D.C. and began her ministry in the days of typewriters. I remember those days, manual typewriters in Columbia, South Carolina. She was called to the First Unitarian Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1988 and retired from there in 2017. The basis of my decision to invite Reverend Robinson to speak was simple. I listened to a sermon she gave. In it, she presented a set of ideas that, in my opinion, lie at the heart of Unitarian Universalism and are key to promoting the diversity of people and ideas that most of us desire. And she expresses those ideas with grace and eloquence. So I am glad she agreed to be with us this morning. Reverend Robinson.
I am also glad to be with you this morning, and from a long way away, and where they're just launched a spaceship over our heads. So we're all in luck this morning. I want to start with a little ditty by UU Minister Gary Kowalski this morning. It's about potlucks. I bet you have potlucks in your fellowship. No, never. Okay. So it goes like this. We thank you, God, for potlucks where a multitude can cook with ingredients and spices that aren't from just one book. From casseroles and dumplings, hors d'oeuvres and canapes, puddings, sauces, pastas to sensational flambés. How boring when there's just one dish or flavor to fit all. How yummy and much more delish when our feasts a free-for-all. Our faith is like a banquet too, with many forms of seasoning, where Christians, Rastafarians, and Jews all do their separate reasoning. But all can share one table, break bread, and sit to eat, enriched by our diversity, from pumpernickel to whole wheat. So we are our own blessing, our gratitudes made real, when we as friends can feed and serve each other in life's meal. There's lots of different kinds of potlucks in our lives, lots of different kinds of diversity. Some we've lived with for so long that we don't even notice them. Others are very new. Some kinds of diversity we're comfortable with, others not so much. Unitarian Universalist values require us to work towards understanding our world, to be compassionate to our neighbors, and that requires that we know them and to be agents of justice in our ever more diverse society. That's a daunting list of requirements, but we're not starting from zero. There are parts of this that we already do very well. I have more than a touch of dyslexia. Sometimes I just don't read what's on the page, and my spelling was the bane of every teacher I ever had back in those typewriter days. I bought a computer I couldn't afford exactly 2 weeks after I first heard the term spell checker. That was almost 40 years ago now. All of this years of computer use have actually made my spelling much better, but every once in a while, my blindness to the exact way letters line up still hangs me up. It did a few weeks ago. As I was thinking about this sermon, I spent a lot of time searching old files for a sermon I knew I had written once about the diversity that unites us. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find any of the other times I had used that phrase. It's really a very important concept of a free faith. Since we don't enforce uniformity of belief, if we leave it up to individual consciousness to discern the truth, then the fact of the matter is that we will have diversity of belief. And then, how do we decide what's in our program? How do we balance freedom and community? It's a perennial theme. And to my mind, that theme coalesces around the phrase, the diversity which unites us. I knew I had used it before, and I couldn't find it anywhere. After a frustrating morning of pasting that phrase into every search mechanism I could think of, I finally looked at it very, very closely. And I realized I'd been searching frantically and for a long time for the diversity which unties us. And of course, that's the danger, isn't it? That the diversity, which is a necessary part of who we are as UUs, as world citizens, even as families, could also unravel us to the point of chaos. We're living in a world that's not only much more diverse than it always was, but we're living closer to those diversities. People have always been different, but now we have to actually deal with that fact at work, at home, on the street, in our congregations. George Will, reflecting on his newly acquired 80 years a few months back, shook his pen in the New York Times as he remembered what he called the casual callousness towards minorities of all sorts that was a part of what some elders call the good old days. He was remembering with regret. Things have changed. We're all adjusting. And it's hard work. But most of us, and the institution we relate to, the Unitarian Universalist Association, believe that it's good work, necessary work. We believe in the worth and dignity of all people, we say, in justice and compassion, and not only for the people who believe just like we do, or love or look just like we do, or who fluently speak the language we were first taught, but everybody. And I would hope that everyone who loves this congregation and feels that our lives are better for its presence are eager to see it fitted out to thrive in this 21st century of diversity, even if they have questions or worries about particular directions. It's the work of our lives in our world right now, and the work of our denomination. I hope our congregations. And one thought I have about this is that we start by looking where we've had some success in thriving with diversity and see what we've experienced and learned that we could take into issues that are seeming harder to us. One place we've discovered the rich blessings of diversity is in theology. So let's dig into that for a few minutes. When I have a chance to explain Unitarian Universalism to ministers in other denominations, they often listen with great respect. And then they say with a puzzled frown, But if you don't all believe the same things, how do you worship together? And that's a good question, because worship is at the center of the life of any religious community. This question really is, there has to be something at your center that holds you together as a group, or you will become fragmented, untied, not together. And I say, yes, actually, there is something, it seems to me, that it's the core of most UUs thinking about religious matters, even if they can't always articulate it. It's not, strictly speaking, a religious belief, and we don't impose it on anyone, but it is there. It's spiritual, but not religious, philosophical rather than devotional. It is, ready for a big word, it is epistemological. Now, you may or may not have ever come across that word before. It's a pretty highfalutin one. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge. Epistemology attempts to answer the question of how we know what we know and how reliable what we think we know really is. Here's what UUs tend to think, that the spiritual dimension of our lives, the meaning dimension, the depth dimension, not to mention the physical part of our lives, is too big, too complicated, too mysterious for any one person to have a total grasp on it. Not popes or Buddhas or gurus or books or popular writers or great religious traditions. Nobody has the whole story, because the whole story is infinite, outside of the capacity of our minds to grasp or our hearts to understand. It's not just that we don't know enough yet. It's not even that our lives are not long enough to learn enough. It's that it is impossible. Now, lest you think that's utter woo-woo, let me remind you that modern physics tells us that even some things in the physical world behave like that. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells us that at the subatomic level, you can only know some things and not others, not because you don't have the right microscope, but because that's just not in the nature of things that you can know everything. Unless you think this philosophy of right life is just the brand newest thing that might go some other way, let me remind you of an ancient Hindu story which tells you the same thing, the blind men and the elephant, which makes the point that when it comes to spiritual truths, we have our vivid experiences, but nobody's experienced the whole elephant. And therefore, if we are wise, we'll use the senses we've been given in our search for truth. But if we are wise, we will be humble about what we know and curious about what others know. For myself, when I come across a new philosophy or new way of thinking about life, one of the ways I assess its value is to ask myself, has anybody ever else thought this way? I mean, I enjoy the idea and the hope that I'm an original thinker, but an awful lot of original thinkers have lived before me, and I do want to respect that. So when I wonder if the epistemology that we base our congregation's lives on is true, I take note of the fact that it is in accord with science, and it has both ancient and modern thinkers on its side. This epistemology is at the base of our tolerance. You see, there are two ways to be tolerant in this world. One can suffer fools gladly, so to speak, leave others alone because to correct them carries unpleasant consequences or is too much trouble. Much religious tolerance in this country is of that sort. The Muslims tolerate the Jews and the Baptists tolerate the Quakers because they're required by law to do so, not necessarily because they respect their beliefs. Real tolerance requires respect. My tolerance of pagans and Muslims and Baptists comes from a fundamental respect for the many ways the divine can be understood, from my own humble knowledge that the faith that works for me is not only not the whole truth, it's not even an adequate truth for anybody but me. And while I'm a theist, a believer in God, but not a Christian believer in God, I'm glad to worship with atheists and humanists and pagans and Christians and agnostics and Buddhists in my Unitarian church, because I learn more about the whole mystery that I myself have not experienced and can't ever experience in that good company. Unitarian Universalists are a non-creedal faith. We don't impose our theology on anybody, and we don't impose an epistemology on anybody either. But in order to do our programming, we have an implicit epistemology, and that postmodern blind men and the elephant approach is what's working for us. Now, you might ask if that makes us wishy-washy, and we say we hope not. We say that we have a fundamental respect for differing understandings of the meanings and spirits of this amazing, huge, beyond understanding world that we live in. So at your fellowship, I hope, people who don't believe in God don't sneer at people who do, and people who sense the spiritual world is feminine don't snarl at those who call God Father, and nobody looks down their nose at those whose most present awareness is that they just don't know. It's a great potluck, our fellowships and churches. You bring what you love to make, you take what you love to eat, and maybe you take a taste of something new if you're feeling adventurous. The only thing you can do wrong at a potluck is complain about what other people like to eat. At this spiritual potluck of ours, we don't demand that everybody love Christmas or celebrate Passover or invoke the 4 directions or study the Tao Te Ching. Different strokes for different folks. We offer variety in the things we do together, and depth and specificity in small groups, and encouragement for individuals to delve deeply into the spiritual paths that make the most sense and bear the most fruits for them. At our best, we encourage people to express their beliefs, and we refrain from scorn and shame. You do refrain from scorn and shame, I hope. We're not always perfect about this, of course, and if your congregation is typical, where you are least perfect is when it comes to Christianity, right? And why is that? Well, it's because it's often harder to refrain from snide comments when one is feeling angry or threatened. Harder to get motivated to understand the complexity of a faith if we felt it was pounded into us, perhaps not in its most sophisticated form as elementary school students. But lest the diversity that we hope unites us begins to untie us, we should take tolerance and curiosity as one of our spiritual disciplines, even when it's hard. We should stop and give ourselves a pat on the back for our ability to live together in freedom, to let our theological diversity unite us rather than untie us. We live in a culture that finds that hard to understand and almost impossible to do. In spite of our occasional lapses, we have a skill that the world needs. It puzzles us sometimes that that skill does not seem to make it automatically easy to achieve other kinds of diversity. Although we've adjusted over a generation to that also difficult for many task of valuing the diversity of the worldviews and men and women, we've adjusted over the past 20 years to sexual and affectional minorities without that much difficulty. Other kinds of diversity have been harder for us. Like the rest of our nation, our congregations are less politically diverse than they were a generation ago. We're overwhelmingly politically liberal and often so rabid about it that even other political liberals can be uncomfortable in our atmosphere. If you're like many UU congregations, the percentage of you who voted Republican in any election lately is in the single digits. A few more, but not many, might call themselves conservatives who have nobody to vote for. In a nation and a state which is split down the middle between the reds and the blues, most UU congregations are a political monoculture. Perhaps you know yourselves best, of course, not always a gentle one. Now, the words liberal and conservative are used in both religion and politics. Unitarian Universalism is a liberal religion, but not necessarily politically liberal, because liberal and conservative mean slightly different things when applied to religion and to politics. There's an overlap that gives us room for a lot of diversity, a lot more diversity than we have right now. Religious liberalism stems from a particular attitude towards religious truth, namely that truth is available to individuals here and now, not just in old traditions or old scriptures, and that the way to follow truth is to let individuals explore and express themselves freely. The motto of religious liberalism might be free to explore. Religious conservatism finds truth in past revelation and in the form of sacred books, which often must be read literally, or in hierarchies, which are often hereditary or institutional, like the Catholic Church's apostolic succession. The motto of religious conservatism is, it's there already, go and study it. In politics, liberalism and conservatism embody a particular orientation to human nature rather than to truth. Political liberalism is based on the belief that people are basically good and they will be good given the right conditions, that our lives are fundamentally social. People are okay. Society together is responsible for building and maintaining the conditions under which most people thrive. Here's a motto for political liberalism: we're all okay and we're in it together. Political conservatism holds that people are not basically good, that they need to be formed to be good, and that we are most fundamentally individuals who must be motivated by personal gain rather than community betterment. One motto for political conservatism might be, a social hierarchy motivates what's best in the most people. So there's a considerable overlap between religious and political understandings of both liberalism and conservatism, but they're not identical. It's possible to be religiously conservative and politically liberal, because actually, if you come right down to it, the great teachers of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were social liberals. My favorite motto of a religiously conservative liberal came from a nun who confronted the homeless and not law-abiding populations in her neighborhood by setting up a lunch program. When she was criticized, she just shrugged. Jesus said, "Feed my sheep," she said. He didn't say, "Only if they have homes," or "only if the law approves of them." He just said, "Feed them." And so she did. It's also possible to be religiously liberal and politically conservative if your religious liberalism is focused on that individual freedom part of our religious life. Our churches were much more politically diverse within living memory. Hopefully, they will be again. Right now, the sense of political threat and the degree of anger between political liberalism and political conservatism is so great that neither side often thinks about how they might be only seeing one aspect of the elephant. It's clear this particular diversity is untying us as a nation, as congregations. The conversation in our congregations, both casual and focused, tends to lack the kind of intellectual skills and practices that we regularly use in other conversations. We need to remember that what is best for our nation and our communities, and in particular, what the best ways to get there, are questions nearly as big as the religious questions about which we have learned to be humble and curious and tolerant. We've got the skills of diversity. We need to use them. Smugness and snideness and put downs, these activities are contrary to our values. They untie us when we need to be united. The polarization of our nation's politicians and the media is making it hard for UUs to live up to our inclusive values. But we still need to try. It's a spiritual discipline to be temperate in speech, even when we feel angry or threatened. It's one we need to practice. It's an ordinary human virtue to be forbearing of those who are not quite up to what we think is our own speed. We continue to charge towards justice. There's no need to trash the different drummers that we're leaving behind. Finally, there's the difficult but very pressing matter of racial and ethnic diversity in our congregations. In that we have a much better attitude, but not much more success. Most congregations would actively like to be more diverse than they are. I believe that that includes yours, and this achievement is eluding us. We're not alone. Religious communities seem to be across society lagging behind schools and workplaces, gyms and neighborhoods as unselfconsciously multicultural. It's ironic, isn't it? 50 years ago, religious institutions were at the forefront of the integration movement, but times have changed. It's one thing to end segregation and another to entirely integrate diversity. That potluck meal that we extolled in the reading. Whoa, try this again. That potluck meal that we extolled in the reading. Sorry, I lost my place. Wait a minute. Okay. Well, let's just move on. The work of the last mid-century was hard. Lots of people paid a hard price for doing it. They changed our society. They didn't make it perfect by any means, nor did the things they achieved stay achieved over more than a generation now. And now we dig in again to the work of racial and ethnic diversity in an even more complex world. It's no good saying, but we worked on this before. It's no good saying, we want to be diverse, but we don't really want to change. It's no good to say, I'm a good and open-minded person, but I'm not going to make the effort to learn anything new, and I refuse to look at the past with new eyes. That's the diversity that will untie us if we don't do the work. I notice that some of you are doing the work, that books are being read and conversations had and groups are discussing, and that's a great start. We UUs need to take the skills that we have honed in the areas where our diversity unites us and move them into a new world that's opening before us. So I offer you these good words of the Reverend Wayne Arneson in a closing reminder of our blessings. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down, there is another truth. You are not alone.
Thank you, Reverend Robinson. We have now come to a time in our service we have set aside for congregational discussion. Reverend Robinson will help facilitate that discussion. I'd like to begin by inviting anyone to share any thoughts you had related to what Reverend Robinson said in her sermon. Well, people are shy, so I'll begin. I think for me, I think my life at UUFFP would be richer. It's rich already, but it would even be richer if we had a greater degree of cultural, racial, and political diversity. I think in the area of cultural and political diversity, we have a good attitude. I think we have respect, as far as I know, of people in the congregation for those, for all cultures and races. In the political area, I'm not sure how to achieve that at our congregation, and that we can get into later. But in the political area, I think in some ways it's a little bit harder. For me, it would be nicer. We've had some very nice political discussions, and they're very interesting. But I think that would even be more interesting if we had one or more people who had a conservative view of the issues we discuss. It would add something to the discussion. And I think we have the attitude that could make somebody comfortable in our congregation who has, let's say, a moderately conservative attitude. But I think it would be hard to have a Trump supporter. I think it might be hard for a Trump supporter to feel comfortable in our congregation. And I wonder what other people think of that. I wonder of that possibility.
So one question that you might ask, I'm going to pass over the Trump supporter part because that's pretty fraught. But one question that you might ask yourselves and see if anybody is either in this category and feels like they can say so is, in what ways do you feel like there are things that you believe or are wondering politically that you don't dare say? In other words, is there a strong, and you all know yourself best. I don't know you at all, so I may be totally off base, but I know in my congregation, I've had people say to me, I think of myself as a political moderate. I have some questions about X, Y, and Z, whatever. But I wouldn't say that at church because I think people would kind of jump down my throat or think less of me or not give me a chance to explain why I think that. And I think that kind of way of social control is part of most groups, and it might be part of yours. But you'll never know unless you can kind of open up a conversation and make it safe for people to say something like that. Does that ring any bells?
It's an interesting question because I think in coffee hour and things, we feel pretty safe about talking about a lot of things. And we've got some very active members. So I don't know. I can't speak for everybody. I can go in my personal life where I probably brought this up before. I had very conservative Christian neighbors, and we had the husband and I had a very large fight the Saturday before Barack was elected. And there are things that he said then that I still think about now. And I just want to, and there are certain times I'd like to go and just ask them what makes this, can you explain why good people voted for a bad man? And I don't want to hurt the friendship, so I don't, because my life without them in it would be very different, and I would miss them terribly. So although it might have worked out, it might work out just fine because we got through the fight. But I haven't felt that same way within the church. Like I usually feel very comfortable, talking about stuff. But I will say, we used to have this conversation after every single service until about, I don't know how many years ago it's been now. We actually had 2 in a row where it became very heated, and we were not treating the person who was speaking with respect and dignity for that other. It was just both cases all out attacks, and they dropped. We're like, forget it. We can't do this to people anymore.
Right.
And so we've done it a few times lately, and things have been much better.
Good. Well, and if you want to keep doing it, you have to have somebody who's authorized to call time, so things don't get out of hand, because we're human beings and things can get out of hand, and you got to plan for that, not just hope, so that somebody can stop the conversation before it gets too hurtful that it destroys conversations, right?
Yeah, you need a moderator.
Yeah, you need somebody with the authority to. Now it's easy on Zoom. All you have to do is turn off the meeting. But when you get back together, not so easy.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? I'm seeing that looks like other folks wanted to.
Kay's speaking, but she's muted.
No, I just was agreeing. I'd like to just, what I'm thinking about now is how we seem to have lost, and I know COVID had a lot to do with it, but racial diversity and sexual diversity seems to be dropping away. And I think that's very important that we try to get more people that are diverse in that way and would have different ideas and cultures. But it just comes back to the whole thing of how do we achieve this? And it seems like our fellowship right now is everybody's on the same page, pretty much, which is very comfortable and nice. But I do remember that service where the speaker was pretty much verbally attacked, and and I can't remember exactly what the service was, but it must have attracted a couple people who don't normally come. So I was kind of puzzled by how people were very outraged about, maybe it's like symbols that were used, or it was very confusing, but it was also very uncomfortable for people. So, maybe we need to be okay with being uncomfortable too sometimes, but I think the moderator idea was a very good idea.
One thing I just noticed looking at your pictures, those of you who have your cameras on, your fellowship has more age diversity than most fellowships. So look at that, you're doing that good.
Wow, we didn't think so.
I don't know why not. You should.
Let me comment on that service where we had some uncivil discussion. A while ago, we had a divergence between people who were sort of new age mystic types and more rationalists, extreme rationalists. And I thought in general we handled it very well. I was on the Sunday service committee, and we agreed. And I tend to, be on the strong rationalist side, but I enjoyed having services in areas that were very different from my own ideas. And I think in the Sunday service committee, we handled that well in that we had a mix of services. Not that many in the New Age mystics, because we didn't have that many people in that area. But then we had an unfortunate incident of somebody not being civil to a person who was in the New Age mystic category.
Look at how big that one incident looms. Definitely worth avoiding.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's why we're losing diversity right now, because with the politically charged climate and all the conflict, if people are just more comfortable going back to groups of people that they have more in common with, it's just a safer place to be right now.
I think you're probably onto something, Ruby.
Yeah.
And then the question is, are you gonna stay there? Or are you gonna push yourself just a little bit?
Yeah, there's a survey that came out. I saw it on the news feed that, they polled, or, they poll everything. But it was that there are more Republicans that have Democratic friends than Democrats that have Republican friends. And I'm like, well, how's that possible? But then I'm thinking, well, it could be one Republican has 10 Democratic friends. But, I thought that was very interesting. And
you have a theory about that, Mary? Why do you think that would be?
I don't know. Because, I do have Republican friends. I mean, and I lost some that I finally figured, it took me about a year to figure out why I lost them. And it turned out, and it was I was going back and like, when did they stop being friends to me? When did I start calling them and finding out when that they didn't have time for me anymore. And where it went down to is we'd had an argument over homosexuality, where I had said, and I'm like, I've got too many gay friends to do any, people are people. And he was just adamant, no. And slowly it dropped and they just pretty much disappeared. So anyway.
I think that also it is harder to be tolerant when you're feeling threatened. And I think at least up until the past election, the Democrat and politically liberal folks in the country were feeling a lot more threatened.
Yeah.
And therefore we're having a lot more trouble finding any truth or goodness in the other side.
Yeah.
That's a guess. And anyway, the whole thing has become so fraught that most of us, when we want to keep our friends or our family members, we just don't talk about religion and politics, which is actually not new. My mother told me that way back in the 60s and 70s when things were much more relaxed than they are now.
Well, I always go back to people have heard it before, where my stepfather, who was about 95, I think, when he said this at the dinner table, and I can't remember what we were discussing, something. It was either Christmas or it wasn't Thanksgiving, but it was sometime we were having this discussion with all of his family around and ours. And my mother's name was Rachel. He said, Rachel and I are not very well rounded. We don't know any Republicans.
Well, that is sort of the way it is, isn't it? I wonder.
One of the kids said, our dad is. And it turned out that he had been, but he changed it. He flipped in 2004. But I love that from a 95-year-old man.
Right. I want to make sure everybody who wants to get a word in edgewise has a chance.
All right, I'll shut myself up.
Anybody else? A thought to share? You got to unmute yourself if you have a thought to share. Anybody?
Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Emily, since you
Emily.
don't have a camera.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. I was just thinking that as far as political diversity, I think that COVID really, because we had to break so many bonds with COVID, it meant that we retreated only to the places where we were sure that people held our same safety standards. And because our safety standards are so strongly correlated with our political views, I think that had a silo effect.
That's interesting. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar, that, not to get political, but Trump came along and we had these big divides, and then COVID came along and it just made everything worse. That whatever divides we had already, everybody just divided and hunkered down. And it was, when you were talking, I was thinking about the concept of tribalism, where like goes with like you tend to hang out with and be friends with people that are like you. And when it comes to people walking in the fellowship, first of all, they're not going to walk in if they don't think they're going to find a tribe of people that are similar to them, and they're not going to stay unless they find a tribe. And now with COVID makes that even more stark.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think y'all are onto something important. So then the question becomes, assuming that we can continue to relax a little bit for a while at least, because we're vaccinated, and then how could we bring back a little bit of the diversity that gives us some spice in our potluck, so to speak, and will help us understand how other people think and feel. And that's, and we might have to do that kind of carefully, given the times.
And how do you do that with children when they're not vaccinated?
Well, yeah. Hopefully 6 months will have solved that problem. But yeah, and so, another thing you're thinking about as you return back to in-person services is how are you going to serve the diversity that's in your congregation now, which is probably now going to include people who need to stay online. Either they have kids or they themselves couldn't get vaccinated, or they don't drive, or whatever it is. That's another kind of diversity. Now we have the in-person and digital diversity that we need to keep on doing the hard work of figuring out how to serve both folks. Don't want our families to start feeling like second-class citizens in our congregations. That would be too bad, because that would then spoil the very admirable age diversity that you all have right now. Your group.
Chris and I right now are at Lakeside, which is a Chautauqua in Ohio on Lake Erie, and it's Methodist, right?
Yeah, the origin goes back to the late 1800s, where it originated as a Methodist camp before it became a larger kind of Chautauqua movement, but it still has that roots in the Methodist Church.
So last year, usually we come out for July 4th, and last July we just weren't comfortable coming out with COVID and and the crowds of people that we knew would be here. But we came out in August, and they have a lot of children's activities, and I was very impressed with how they conducted their children's activities. So they're very science-minded. Like, there's a lot of doctors and people who are active in politics, and like there's people here that have founded hospitals. They're very intelligent, very science-minded, and they push the children's activities farther than I would have been comfortable without them. And I just had trust in them. They had everything outside, and they had everyone socially distanced, and lots of hand sanitizer and lots of masks, and they were great with the microphones and the speakers and the video sermons, and I was just really impressed. And when I started talking, I really thought this had to do with what the conversation was, and now I totally lost my train of thought where I was going with it.
Well,
but
yeah, maybe you were headed.
Help me tie it back.
Maybe you were headed towards the point that there's ways that we can do things, ways that we can kind of return to that diversity, and even bring in those families if we're smart about it and
I was really impressed with what they did. Beyond impressed, to where I felt comfortable and safe, and it was a good feeling.
Yeah.
We'll pick your brain when you get back.
Okay.
Yes, right.
I do know we're trying with technology to keep the virtual integration that we've been able to achieve, and even expand on it a little bit. We want the people that don't feel comfortable getting together in person to be able to continue to join our services and join the congregation virtually.
Great.
So we're trying very hard to not only retain that, but also expand it.
Great. And I assume as congregations start figuring this out, there will be lots of resources on the UUA website, just as there were musical resources and so on last year. Definitely worth looking for, because many of our congregations are trying to do this. So any others? Justine, you got anything you want to add to this, or Linda? No? Okay.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our service. We're going to have coffee hour afterwards right away. And we could continue. Anybody who has any comments they'd like to make, anything that didn't come to mind during the formal service, I'd be happy to bring it up for you to bring it up during coffee hour. So now we will extinguish the chalice to end our service. We end our service today by extinguishing the chalice. May the memory of its light and the light of this service stay with us. Mary, would you extinguish the chalice? Okay, coffee hour begins.